saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, there are some observations that I think might challenge some of our thinking around Jesus that I want to make tonight as we start to unpack what's happening here. And the first thing I really want you to catch is this, that Jesus sends his disciples into the storm. Did you catch this? Jesus sent his disciples into the storm. Like, the disciples didn't choose to go for a boat ride. They were like, "Hey, you guys want to go for a row? And like, let's jump in the boat. And like, Jesus, you need some alone time. We're going to go like row the boat for a while."
Charging here.
I don't mind being. And we come to verse 24. It says, "But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night," let me just explain, in the fourth watch of the night, this is somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. So this is in the middle of the night, early morning hours, right? They're battling the waves. They're exhausted. So some of us have had nights like this, right? Where you've had to work on something through the night, or you've had to weather some sort of storm. Maybe you were camping. Maybe you had some sort of experience. Those of you that have had kids, maybe you've had a kid that was sick and you're just exhausted and the kid's not doing well in the middle of the night. You're just battling and there's that exhaustion. You're like, is this going to ever end? Will these kids ever grow up and leave my house? And the answer is yes, they eventually do. But you just, there's these nights that just seem like they will never end. And you're battling. That's what's happening here. It's the fourth watch of the night and they're exhausted. And then it says in the next verse, it says, "And he," speaking of Jesus, "came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It's a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. And immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' And he said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and he came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.' So Jesus immediately reached out his hand. He took hold of him, saying to him, 'Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" Now, there are some observations that I think might challenge some of our thinking around Jesus that I want to make tonight as we start to unpack what's happening here. And the first thing I really want you to catch is this, that Jesus sends his disciples into the storm. Did you catch this? Jesus sent his disciples into the storm. Like, the disciples didn't choose to go for a boat ride. They were like, "Hey, you guys want to go for a row? And like, let's jump in the boat. And like, Jesus, you need some alone time. We're going to go like row the boat for a while and you can catch up with us later." No, it says immediately after the whole miracle of feeding people, Jesus put them in the boat and said, "Go." Like, you row off into the storm. Jesus sends them out. We're talking about Jesus doing this. I think about this whole scenario. I go, well, Jesus could have done any number of other things in this. Like, first of all, he could have just had them hold out and wait, right? "Hey, guys, I need some alone time. I'm going to go spend some time praying up in the hills. I'll be back in a little while. And trust me, I'm stronger than all of you because I'm Jesus and I'll help you row," right? He could have done that. He could have just prayed for traveling mercies and a hedge of protection. That's what Christians do, right? You're going on a trip. You're going to go row across the sea somewhere. You pray for traveling mercies and the seas get flat and everything gets good. Jesus could have done that, right? Because Jesus is Jesus, he could have parted the sea like Moses and they could have just walked on dry land, right? Could have done all of those things, but that's not what Jesus does. He puts them in a boat and he says, "Start rowing." And I want you to catch this. Jesus is perfectly comfortable with them being uncomfortable because of the storm. You see this? Like, he sends them out and he's comfortable with this. makes me want to ask this question. Does the Jesus that you follow do this sort of thing? Does the Jesus that you follow, your idea of who Jesus is, do you expect Jesus to push you off and be perfectly comfortable with you being in a storm and uncomfortable? Or is your conception of who Jesus is, the way you think of the Jesus you're following, the kind of Jesus who says, no, like I only send you out on smooth days. Like, in fact, for some of us, we would actually say the reason I follow Jesus is so I can avoid storms, right? Like the whole point of me following you, Jesus, is because I don't want to be in these circumstances. And so it sort of confronts some of our thinking around who Jesus is. And could it be that in our effort to avoid the chaos, in our effort to avoid the storms and to only have flat, calm seas, that we're actually missing out in the unconventional ways of Jesus? He sends them directly into the storm, and then he goes to pray. That really makes me wonder about my own storms, my own situation. I mean, what if the situation I'm in, which by the way, just because I stand up here doesn't mean I don't have storms. Doesn't mean that there are scenarios where I feel very uncomfortable because of the circumstances of my life. And I know the same is for you, but think about the situation that you're in or that I'm in. Is God perfectly comfortable with the uncomfortable that I'm in? What if God has me right here, right now, because he wants to show me something? Like, what if he isn't rescuing me from my situation, not because he doesn't love me, but because he wants me to see something about who he is, and the only way that's going to happen is in the middle of a storm? What if God's restraining himself, and he's not delivering me from whatever storm I'm in, because ultimately what he cares about is doing something in me rather than simply doing something for me? I know this challenge. If God is love, how is that love? How is Jesus loving if this is what he's doing? Right? Hey guys, I want you to row out into the storm. You're going to learn some lessons, and by the way, you are completely outside of that, right? That's not very loving, but Jesus has control over the storm. So he sends them out into circumstances. He has complete control, and he proves that later. So Jesus is loving, and then he's still in control of the scenario. Secondly, Jesus knows what's best for us, and he does what's best for us. That's the definition of love. He knows what's best for us, and he still does what's best for us, even when that creates tension in our own hearts and our own thinking. Like Tim Keller, writing on that same concept, he says this. He says, if you have a God great enough and powerful enough to be mad at because he doesn't stop your suffering, you also have a God who's great enough and powerful enough to have reasons that you can't understand. And you can't have it both ways. There's an interesting note in this that in the Gospel of Mark, we actually read the same story in the Gospel of Mark. There's 4 biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of those biographies are written from a little different perspective, and they really target a different audience. Mark is actually written from the perspective of Peter. Mark sort of transcribed Peter's story of who Jesus is. And so Mark includes some details that aren't included in the same story in Matthew chapter 14. And there's one particular thing that's really kind of crazy. When Mark tells this story, he says that when they were out in the storm and they're struggling, it says that Jesus was passing by them. Like it was an accident. Like they ran into each other out. Like those guys were rowing against the waves, and Jesus was like, and he's like, oh. They all like, Jesus, like, help. Like it's like this moment. So he describes them passing by. He's like, okay, what in the world's going on? Is this sort of random that they bumped into each other in the storm on the sea? Or could there be more to this? It's really fascinating. That language of Jesus passing by, that parallels some language that we see in Exodus chapter 33 and Exodus chapter 34. It also, in Matthew chapter 14, the one we're in here, it also has language in it that in a similar way parallels something that we read about in Exodus 33 and 34. And these are the similarities. It's really kind of a beautiful thing. In Exodus 33, Moses approaches God and he says, God, I want to see your glory. Like, I want to see you. I want to know you. I want you to reveal yourself to me in a powerful way. And so God says to Moses, I'm going to do this, but here's what you're going to do. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of a rock. I'm going to kind of shove your face down in the dirt. And then I'm going to pass by you. Like, my glory is going to pass by you. It's going to pass you by. The same language that Mark uses to describe Jesus when he passes by the boat. He says, I'm going to pass by you. And then when you read about this happening, the Lord reveals himself to Moses and he says, this is who I am. I am the Lord. Now, I know you probably didn't bring a Greek New Testament with you this evening, but when we come to Matthew chapter 14 and Jesus is walking by the disciples and they cry out, he says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. But if you actually look at the Greek language, and instead of saying, it is I, he says, ego eimi. That's the Greek word, ego eimi. He says, take heart, ego eimi. Ego eimi is translated literally, I am. It's one of the names of God. It's one of the names that God uses to say, like, before everything was, I am. Jesus, in this moment, he's passing by the disciples. He's revealing his glory to them. And then when they call out to him, he says, I am, I am. I am the creator of the storm that you sit in. I am the creator of this universe in which you find yourself. Jesus is saying, this is who I am. You are seeing me in all of my glory, and it is in circumstances that you never would have imagined. See, for them, they probably thought it'd be a really great worship service at Summit Church on a Sunday night. Like, that's when we're going to see the glory of God. But in the middle of a storm, in the middle of these sorts of circumstances, yeah, I don't know the specific storm that you're facing. Some of our storms are really obvious. They're really simple to ask people to pray for. You know, sometimes we lose jobs, and we have relationships that just blow apart, and we have financial problems, and sometimes like we have just situations that take place, and then some of those things are really easy just to put on a piece of paper, to tell a group of people and say, man, would you pray for me? I'm walking through this storm. Others of us, maybe it's not that forward to identify. Maybe it's not that clear and it's more nuanced. And for some of us, maybe it's just emotional things. Maybe there's anxiety that we deal with, or maybe there's depression or sadness that we're wrestling with. Maybe they're just these questions like, do I really believe these things and do I lean into them, or do I just sort of like